Okay, Jim, thank you for your introduction. Is this coming through okay? Yes, okay. And just before I begin this talk, what I like to do is really just to kind of almost contextualize my context so that I don't feel that, or you don't feel that I'm speaking into some sort of vacuum. And in doing that, I often tell a true story of three boys who were all born in the late 1950s, early 1960s, just ordinary kids. They could have been born in St Joe here or in St Cloud, ordinary kids just growing up in Belfast. Two of those young boys went to religious Sunday school together as young boys. Another two of those boys went to what we would call primary school together, educated from age 4 to age 11 before going to what would be our high school or your high school. One of those boys is now dead. He was murdered during an internal loyalist paramilitary feud in the mid-1970s. And the second boy ended up serving a life sentence of 18 years, again in a paramilitary killing where he literally slit someone ear to ear and dumped their body in a back alley. And I was the third boy, who ends up a Methodist clergy person. I've told that story, I'm guessing globally, on hundreds of occasions. And I still tonight honestly couldn't give you a very clear, discrete, clinical answer why my life did not go the same way. Because many young men, and to a lesser degree young women, from both a Catholic tradition and a Protestant tradition, the kind of strapline or the phraseology I've often used is they made the wrong choices for allegedly the right reasons. And I often use the statistic that 80% of people that ended up in the penal system in Northern Ireland during the conflict would not have been there if they had grown up in St Cloud or St Joe's. So there was a context that made people make abnormal choices because of that conflict. A former senior member of the most lethal Protestant paramilitary grouping, Billy Mitchell, who died a few years ago there of a heart attack, kind of tongue-in-cheek said, someone in the late 1960s did not fly over Northern Ireland and spray us all with loony gas and we all started killing each other. So there was some context that made people who should have been living normal lives do very abnormal things. Let me just give you a few statistics just to kind of contextualize this numerically. 30,000 people went through our penal system. There were over 47,000 injuries, almost 37,000 shootings, over 22,000 armed robberies, over 16,000 bombings or attempted bombings, over 2,200 arson attacks, and a population of 1.7 million people. Let me pull that into the American context. 800,000 deaths and 6.4 million political prisoners. So it literally shredded that Northern Irish community, and there were very few families untouched by that conflict. I mean, I was asking someone the population approximately of your twin cities, and someone said it's just over 2 million. So you think of that statistic over a 30-year period within this state in your two twin cities, and the kind of catastrophic effect it would have. As Jim mentioned earlier, we painfully, and the operative word being painfully, after 2 protracted years of negotiation, moved towards what we called the Good Friday Agreement. Let me give you another twist. The Catholics primarily call it the Good Friday Agreement, more or less. Protestants like to call it the Belfast Agreement. We can't even agree on the darn name. But I'll use the Good Friday Agreement as it seems to have more spilled into vogue and into kind of popular language and thinking. But I've often commented it was a masterpiece really in what you and I would call political compromise. Not always necessarily a masterpiece in peace building. I've often quoted my good friend Francis Tini, who's a researcher at Queen's University, where he has this wonderful phraseology where he says, we most certainly knew how to end the war, we just don't know how to build a peace. And that painful, protracted journey to integrated communities, communities that understand each other, communities that tolerate each other, is still a painful process that almost 20 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, we're still just limping along there. Let me just give you a very brief historical background to the conflict. People often ask, what are the roots of that conflict in Northern Ireland? Where did they start? So just let me give you a kind of few key dates. 1170, okay, we like our history. Just I was saying there earlier on to Jim there that Senator George Mitchell, tongue-in-cheek, said the Irish have an inexhaustible locker of history. So 1170, settlers would have arrived from, at that stage, Britain into Ireland. But really the 17th century, what was called the Plantation of Ulster began. So Lowland Scots, English began to plant particularly that northeastern part of the island. 1641, the Catholic Gaelic uprising in response to the plantation and confiscation of land by Protestant settlers from England and from Scotland. 1690, the Battle of the Boyne and the victory of the Protestant William III over Catholic James II. And every year that victory is celebrated on July the 12th. We are obsessed by parades in Northern Ireland. Do you know how many we have per year? You wouldn't even guess this. 4,400. And a population of 1.7 million people. But politics and religion being what it is, Catholic King James was blessed by the Pope and defeated by a Protestant king. A toxic mix of kind of religion and politics in the 17th century Europe. In 1801, the Act of Union abolished the Irish Parliament and really bound Ireland and Britain together as parts of the United Kingdom. 1912 was a kind of interesting year because at that stage the British government, the liberal British government, decided we're going to disengage from Ireland. So the northeastern Unionists, Protestants, Loyalists, formed basically a militia force of 100,000 men called the Ulster Volunteer Force. Almost 500,000 people signed a covenant. And listen to the word covenant. Where does the word covenant come from? It's a biblical word. In the same way as many rabbis I would work with and others would tell me clearly, Gary, the covenant of the land is ours. So these Protestants signed the Ulster Covenant. My grandfather signed it. I can go online and see Thomas Mason, 7 Victor Street, where he signed the Ulster Covenant. So, bizarrely, those people who wanted to remain British were going to fight who? The British Army, to stay British. Because the British government wanted the British Army to deal with these rebellious Ulster Protestants who they wanted to be part of Ireland. But never to be outdone, in Ireland, the Catholics formed their militia, a nationalist grouping of 100,000 people. And Ireland was set literally for a very bloody civil war. The 1914 outbreak of the First World War. And the British are pretty clever. What they simply did was take the Ulster Volunteer Force, that militia group of 100,000 well-trained armed men, and made them a British regiment, the 36th Ulster Division, who suffered massive casualties at the Battle of the Somme. First World War eventually ends. And you can imagine the pressure that Ulster Protestants and Unionists were putting on the British government. We have sacrificed our own blood on the fields of Flanders, on the Somme. We want a reward. And the reward was the creation or partition, depending what side you're on, For the Protestants, it was the creation of Northern Ireland. To the Catholics, they have partitioned our island. And so Northern Ireland in 1921 was established as a state. Just spilling on a little bit from that, 1968. And I say quite categorically that there was discrimination by Protestants, and particularly legislative discrimination in education and in housing and also in employment. And in the late 1960s, really the starting point of typical Irish understatement that we call the Troubles, and which was really a managed civil war primarily, is probably the best way to describe it. And a campaign for Catholics in Northern Ireland for civil rights, but it also must be said that there were a number of leading liberal Protestants also involved in that civil rights movement. And depending again, of course, what side of the fence you were on, I hosted a seminar there in Belfast a number of years ago entitled Civil Rights or Civil Unrest. So you know who went for the civil rights title? The Catholics. Who went for civil unrest? Naturally, the Protestants. So there's not even agreement on how the actual conflict came about. But short to say, as a kind of young kid in those late 1960s, Belfast was constantly ablaze. Eventually, the British Army came in primarily to segregate those two communities that were hell-bent on destroying one another. And we really went through almost 2 decades of very severe violence. I mean, my wife Joyce and I, as we were travelling over with Jim there to the university here tonight, literally every morning as a young boy, when I either went to sleep at night hearing bombs in the distance, woke up literally every morning knowing that there would have been overnight deaths. So that was the climate. Hunger strikes spilled about, as you know, in the early 1980s, and really the Republican movement, or the IRA, began to kind of redefine their campaign, in the sense that primarily, up until then, their campaign would have been militaristic, guerrilla warfare, freedom fighters, paramilitaries, terrorism, whatever phraseology there you want to use. They began to move towards a political strategy as well as a military strategy. So the strapline that was coined was the ballot box in one hand and the Armalite in the other. So let me tell you another movement today. We'll not stay in Ireland, we'll dip in and out of the Middle East and do a little bit of poking around here in North American society as well. Hamas. Hamas a number of years ago primarily were a movement that pursued their political goals through terrorism, freedom fighters, whatever phraseology you want to use. Today, Hamas have modelled themselves on the IRA, because today Hamas have the strategy of the ballot box in one hand and the Armalite in the other. I suppose the hope for many of us that work in the Middle East, the hope is that eventually groups like Hamas will embrace a political strategy to pursue their political goals. So early 1990s, there were a lot of what you would say backroom conversations taking place. The British were whispering quietly to the IRA were whispering quietly to the British government. Protestant paramilitaries were involved in backroom conversations, which eventually led up to the 1994 ceasefires. The IRA broke that ceasefire once, restored the ceasefire, and in 1998, as I mentioned, we moved towards the Good Friday Agreement. A question I'm often asked on numerous occasions is the question, was this a religious conflict? Or was it a religious war? It's a question that's often asked. And I always answer it in a kind of semi-nebulous fashion by saying yes and no. So what I would suggest is this. Ireland has had a history of religious sectarianism. And I would suggest that that toxic religious sectarianism created the fertile soil, or watered the soil, to allow what was primarily a conflict about land and about identity to occur. Let me tell you my reasoning behind that. For 2 years, from 1990 to 1992, there were a group of Catholics and Protestants, both lay and clergy, who spent 2 years, one Saturday a month, looking at the roots of religious sectarianism within the island of Ireland. One of the co-chairs of that was Mary McAleese, and as you know, Mary served 2 terms as the Irish president. Mary and I remain good friends to this day. She's currently over in St Mary's College, which is a Catholic college in London, where Francis, my name is gone, Joyce Francis, my good friend, who was the former British ambassador to the Holy See. Francis is the vice-chancellor there at St Mary's College. But Mary co-chaired that along with a Protestant guy from Derry called John Lampin. And let me just kind of tell you some of let's assume the discoveries we made in relation to that. Okay. So a little bit of theology, not too much tonight, I promise, but just listen in for a moment, okay? The doctrine of the one true church, we all have heard that doctrine, okay? We're all probably familiar with it. Our church is the only true church, and if you're outside our church, your chances of salvation are much diminished at best. I'm talking about the roots now, okay? I know things have changed and relations ecumenically are much better, but we're looking at kind of 17th century Ireland and some of that kind of toxicity that was spilling about there in the early part of the 20th century. Interestingly, this doctrine that error has no right is much lesser known. It was developed by St. Augustine to justify the use of state coercion to suppress his heretical opponents because they were simply radically in error. So they have no right to express or hold their beliefs. And ever since that doctrine has been put, the similar use as the principle behind every use of coercion, especially state coercion, for religious purposes. So error has no right is the doctrine behind penal laws. So it's not just one tradition or other. Both Catholics and Protestants have used this doctrine very, very effectively. Penal laws, inquisitions, forced conversions, and similar other ugly stains on Christian history. Providence simply means the basic teaching God is at work in the world, and beyond that, the faithful Christian can discern God's will and purpose by reading the signs of the times in human events and the natural world. So you'd say, seems quite simple. Bear with me. Let me twin some of these doctrines, and let's see what happens. So let's twin one true church, okay, with error has no right. So the doctrine of there being one true church, we say it's a truth claim, okay? Like every truth claim, it automatically carries with it the danger of arrogance and imposition. But let's be honest, those are only dangers. They're not necessarily outcomes. Everything, I would suggest, depends on how the truth claim is made. So if this truth claim is made consciously and humbly, you don't have to impose it on others. So for example, if there is a church in St. Joe's and St. Cloud's that says, all you Catholics in this university are going to hell, you know what, you want to believe that? That's fine, don't annoy me. But if you start imposing it on other people, it becomes a totally different scenario. So let me just kind of continue that a little bit more. So error has no right. The chances are your truth claim is made disastrously. Because if your church is the only true church and error has no right, it's your duty to see that error is suppressed by whatever means necessary. So tolerance isn't a virtue. Tolerance becomes a deadly vice. So let's combine one true church with providence. Providence, as I mentioned, teaches God is at work in the world. But let's put providence with one true church. It's very easily reduced to God is on our side. Bring again the doctrine in error has no right. God is on our side more than likely means God wants us to suppress others. So the disastrous consequences are obvious. So for example, the Ulster Volunteer Force that I mentioned earlier, what is their motto? For God and Ulster. Because God is on their side. I could have taken you to murals in Republican Catholic West Belfast, where a picture of the Virgin Mary is put with her hair flowing in the shape of what? The island of Ireland. So that mixture of religious iconography with a militia cause. We all know God was also a South African. According to the Afrikaners, God gave us this land. And in case you're all going to get off light tonight, which you're not, what happened here? The early white settlers. God is on our side. Pulling verses from the Old Testament, we cleanse the land. We purify the land. Using the model of Israel, remove those Amalekites. Who became the Amalekites? The Native Americans. So that whole toxicity of God being on our side, it's chaotic, it's messy, and it's spilled, sadly, out of Christian theology. But here's another bizarre one. 17th century France, interestingly, makes a useful comparison to Ireland. Because not only did French Protestants in a Catholic state suffer under a similar set of disabilities similar to those endured by British and Irish Catholics in Protestant states, but believe it or not, the rival regimes actually kept an eye on one another. So penal laws in Britain and Ireland were sometimes justified by reference to the French treatment of Protestants, and French penal laws were justified by what British and Irish Catholics were suffering. Jonathan Sacks, who is the chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth, said this: on one point, and it is a substantial one, the critics of religion are right. Religion has done harm. It has led to crusades, jihads, inquisitions, and pogroms. It has shed the blood of human sacrifice in the name of high ideals. People have hated in the name of the God of love, practiced cruelty in the name of the God of compassion, waged war in the name of the God of peace, and killed in the name of the God of life. These are undeniable facts, and they are terrifying. And the great believers have always known this. I mean, Pascal said, men never do evil so completely and cheerfully as when they do it from a religious conviction. Jonathan Swift, the writer of Gulliver's Travels, who was the Dean of Christ's Cathedral in Dublin, we have just enough religion to make us hate, but not enough religion to make us love one another. And my own Belfast-born C.S. Lewis, the Chronicles of Narnia, who, as you know, was professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University, said, I think we must fully face the fact that when Christianity does not make a man very much better, it makes them very much worse. And Sacks suggests this happens not because religion is religion, but because human beings are human beings, not angels and certainly not God. Religion is power. It bonds people together as a group. It moves people to act. It changes lives. Then he says this very pertinent point. And whatever has power can be used, misused, and abused. And Sacks suggests religion is like fire. It warms, but it also burns. And we are the guardians of the flame. We often look back to that awful time, we would say, in 17th century Ireland. But surely us 20th, 21st century people are much more sophisticated. Let me just give you a couple of quick stories, and I'm trying to keep an eye on time, and it's always what it always happens. We never get through this. Let me just give you a A couple of quick stories. Catholic atrocities, 1641. They burned those people almost and buried them alive. Against the British, 17 persons, they hanged them till they were half dead. They cast them into a pit. They covered them over with a little earth. Some were wounded, so they hanged them again. They put ropes around their necks. They drew them through water. They often decided how many blows can an Englishman endure before he dies. They rip their bellies out. They leave their guts running about their heels. But they reserved the most cruel torture for women, whose sex they neither pitied nor spared, hanging up several women, many of them great with child, whose bellies they ripped out as they hung and let the little infants fall out. Why did those Catholics do that? Was it just them? Oh no. The officials put the Catholic archbishop's bare feet in boots. They filled it with oil. They tied his legs to the uprights of the stalk and they lit a fire beneath. The official in charge of the torture rushed suddenly from the room because he didn't want to look at such monstrous barbarity, but others stayed. The Calvinistic torturers feasted for a while in these extraordinary cruelties and left the archbishop early in the morning, dying from his continual torture. Then they took him to a field not far from Dublin Castle and hanged the innocent man from the gallows with a noose made from brushwood. "350 years later, August 1994, Sean Monaghan, young Catholic man abducted in West Belfast by a member of a loyalist paramilitary organisation. He escaped through a window, eventually was recaught, was bound, gagged with black tape, tortured and murdered a short distance away. The IRA murder of Jean McConville. 4 women take Jean from her house at gunpoint, driven to an unknown location. She was shot in the back of the neck, apparently while kneeling. Some have suggested she was also tortured in the post-mortem, cracked bones and mutilated hands. Early 1970s. The modern 20th, 21st century. Japanese professor said, an incomprehensible act becomes comprehensible if it's explained in conjunction with religion. An incomprehensible act becomes comprehensible if it is explained in conjunction with religion. So what do we do? What is the role of the church, of people of faith, of people of goodwill when you're faced with such barbarity? Do we leave peace processes to the politicians? A friend of mine and a colleague, a professor at Queen's University, John Brewer, does this amazing kind of comparison between what he calls the political peace process and the social peace process. Let me just give you a few quotations from John. He says this: the negotiated settlement is never the end of peacemaking, for accords mostly leave unresolved the processes for realizing social healing. The problem is that societal healing is either ignored by negotiations in the political peace process or assumed to flow naturally from the signing of the agreement. I think it's a rather naive assumption that once you sort out problematic politics, societal healing occurs without any effort. But John suggests if you recognize there is a social peace process, a need for healing within society, peace processes become your responsibility, my responsibility. So social peace is everyone's, not just the politicians. Time is going. There will not be 8 points. We'll take a few moments on this and then open some of it up for questions. What is the role of people of faith in this? Within the island of Ireland, and particularly in Northern Ireland, there have been a number of very, very courageous clergy. One of those was Father Alec Reid. He was a Redemptorist priest, based in Clonard Monastery in West Belfast. And Alec, for years, dialogue with the IRA, acting as a persuader, as an influencer, to try to move them away from political violence. He was one of the main instigators of what was known now as the Hume Adams Talks, which in the early 90s, John Hume, who was the moderate nationalist leader of the primarily Catholic SDLP, he set up that whole dialogue. Interestingly, one of John Hume's phrases and concerns was about our peace process, and to a degree he was quite right. He says his concern about the Good Friday Agreement was that we end up with a form of benign apartheid. So not like institutional apartheid that you have in South Africa, but benign apartheid, with the resultant effect that 90% of people still within Northern Ireland live in segregated areas. Alec was chosen by the IRA to witness their decommissioning, and my other good friend Harold Good, who's a Methodist minister, well now into his 70s, they were the two people that were chosen by the IRA to witness their putting their weapons beyond use. The Ulster Volunteer Force, that were the most lethal Protestant paramilitary organisation I've worked extensively with over 2 decades. And when they did their decommissioning statement, they chose to do that decommissioning statement from what you would sort of call in American terms your fellowship hall. We call it our sort of church hall in that context. And I still remember that day. It's the last Saturday in June 2009. And the statement was read. The world's media were there. They were made to lower their cameras because the person that was reading it did not want his face beamed over the world's media. But the statement was read from the church lectern, which I would preach my sermon from the next day. The backdrop to that statement was literally a display of flowers that we moved from the fellowship hall into the church sanctuary for the service the next day. There were no paramilitary flags. There were no men sitting behind tables with ski masks on, dressed in black. Why do I tell that story? Because people like ourselves, even if you're practicing faith or not practicing faith, have a very, I would suggest to you, strategic responsibility to work within society for systemic change. Politicians, by and large, do not do this. Because primarily politicians spend their lives looking over their own shoulders, watching their own constituency base, and they basically end up politicians to their own tribe. Primarily, most politicians are not statesmen or stateswomen. So as you look at your society today, and I'm not going to do a Republican-Democrat debate because I want to get out of here alive tonight and travel up to the Twin Cities and speak there tomorrow, but let me just say a couple of things. I'm doing work at the moment with Emory University in Atlanta, looking at the whole concept of racism and sectarianism. I would suggest that both of those have what I would call bad religious theological roots. And a professor who is up in Union Theological Seminary, Presbyterian Seminary up in Upper West Side in Manhattan, about 2 years ago wrote an article trying to deal with some of the racial divisions within the United States. And he just had this little interesting phrase which sort of irked me, disturbed me, and I just couldn't resist commenting on it, with the result of the fact the bishop in Florida said, we want you to look at some work around this. The phrase was very simple, but it said this: no one in the United States wants to talk about slavery. Okay? So I pulled that phrase out, and I said, interesting S word, the word slavery. Let me tell you about my S word. My S word was sectarianism. And I said in the 1960s, when I was a very young boy growing up, 50s, 40s, I wasn't born, no one wanted to talk about sectarianism. No one wanted to deal with sectarianism. With the resultant effect, we ended up with a 30-year civil war. I wrote in the article, I am not suggesting to American society that you are going to end up with a 30-year civil war. But I am suggesting that if you don't deal with the legacy of the past, your cities will become more violent and more segregated. And you know that's true. You know that's true. So our biggest challenge, peace process wise, if you were to say to myself or say to my wife Joyce, what is the biggest issue? What is the ghost hanging over your society at the moment? Let me tell you what it is. Dealing with the legacy of the past. So even though we have American senators, American Congress people over trying to move us forward, that is our biggest issue. How we deal with the past. And unless we deal with it within some structured framework, let me just pull this together for a moment. United Nations Handbook on Reconciliation talks about a forced amnesia. We all know what amnesia is. You forget. Okay, so they cite examples like Cambodia, countries in Latin America. And a forced amnesia is unhealthy for a number of reasons. It lets perpetrators off the hook. It doesn't give a proper place to victims. And it also doesn't allow you to look at the systemic roots that caused the conflict in the first place. The problem, I think, this is my own personal opinion, I think Irish society is that, this is forced amnesia, zoom, we're completely at the other end of the spectrum. It's George Mitchell's quotation, we have this inexhaustible locker of historical stories. So our struggle or challenge is going to be, how do we get some mechanism that allows us to deal with the past without it being like a ghost that continually haunts us? And that is going to be one of the challenges. But I would suggest that American society needs to have some form of structure or mechanism to allow a conversation to begin around that. You may say, Gary, that is a mammoth task. I would suggest actually it's not. And let me give you my blueprint, okay, the Irish man, the Methodist man's blueprint. If you're telling me tonight that people here who are leading academics in this university and other universities in this state and across this nation cannot twin with well-meaning people of faith and other people in NGOs to put together some comprehensive encounter program, there's actually something wrong. A model that allows people from both those ethnic groupings, of black and white and others, to come into a room to ask those hard, difficult questions. I spent 30 years bringing people together who were involved in terrorism, who were murdering each other, who now sit with me in the same room with Israelis and Palestinians and others, sharing the story of their pain, the compromises, the legacy of the conflict, and painfully trying to build a new future. This is the richest country in the world. It's the most highly educated country in the world. There must be some process or some mechanism that can be brought about, even small scale. That's your social peace process versus your political peace process. So do you let your politicians drive your agenda, or does society take ownership of what the future of this nation, or my nation, or other nations look like? So within your own framework, what does a social peace process look like? What has happened in Northern Ireland, as my friend Eamon Malley, the political journalist, has said, is really a political miracle. Why? Because politicians and people in civic society took strategic risks. In the final story, I'll tell you, and then we can open it up for questions. You may be a Republican here tonight, you may be a Democrat, and Bill Clinton was not a perfect man, as we all know. But let me tell you one thing he did do that was right. He took strategic, thoughtful risks in relation to the Irish peace process. And in 1997, I was spearheading a project, myself as a Methodist clergy person, with a Catholic Dominican sister who had spent 25 years in South Africa struggling against apartheid. We put together this centre together on the interface, the peace line, those Berlin-type walls that separate Protestants and Catholics in Belfast. And Clinton did his keynote speech literally 50 metres behind that building that Noreen and I put together, drove down Springfield Road, turned onto the Falls Road, and coincidentally Gerry Adams just happened to be coming out of the bakery with his morning scones, as I'm sure he often did, okay? And Clinton's car stopped. And Clinton got out with the world's media there and shook his hand. Was that a risk for the most powerful man in the world? You're dead right, it was. Because it could have backfired. Now, I no doubt whatsoever, and you know as well as I do, there were an awful lot of conversations behind closed doors before that handshake took place. But there was no guarantee. Something could have happened where the IRA felt we need to move back to a political struggle within a militaristic framework. But he took a risk. And those kind of strategic risks were bringing people who had pursued political violence in from the cold. So those are the kind of strategic risks all of us need to take in different ways and different formats. It is not up to me tonight to tell you how to resolve some of your latent underlying problems within this nation, but I would say it's up to you to begin to wrestle with some of those concepts, with some of those possibilities, some thinking outside the box, some dreaming dreams that may make this nation. I mean, I was preaching in a church in Colorado there a few weeks ago. My wife would have said, you say this all the time, you say you're going to finish, and you go on and on and on, but I promise, because I've just got the evil eye, and I need to do what I'm told, this is my last story. So I was preaching this church in Colorado, which was the largest Methodist church in Colorado, and then the kind of sort of last service, the 11 o'clock service, behind me was a youth choir. Around about 50 to 55 teenagers. And without getting into the Republican-Democratic dialogue, I simply asked one question. Is the way you are doing politics in America at the moment setting a template for moral leadership for these 50 kids behind me? And I'll answer that. The answer is no. Categorically no. Because that is the model for a future generation, that you deal by slandering people, by condemning people, by trashing people. I mean, is that the model? Would you like this university to function in that model? Would you like your professors to function in that model? Would you like your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your parents to function in that model? We all know the answer is categorically no, because it's fundamentally flawed and wrong. So what template and how do you change that possible? This is my 60th visit to the United States. I mean, I know this country, I love this country. It shaped me in many ways as well. But I said to a close friend, I hope the United States is not losing its soul. As I look at some of the political theatre, if you could even call it that, because it's pretty bad theatre, that is ongoing at the moment. So let me stop there before my wife goes, okay, right, go. So give me some questions and some comments, and we'll see, can we map out a few bits and pieces? Do you want to moderate there, Jim? Okay.
Questions?
Come on now. Every class, Dan will tell you at the back, who's over in Cloud, once one person goes, there's an avalanche. So there's a man's going to kick off.
Did you establish any programs to set up primary schools that would be for both Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland?
Not personally, because I'm not in that sort of field of what you would call education. 93% of our children are still educated separately. And that's another challenge. But what I did do was I sort of didn't do the sort of career thing. So from 92 to 99, I was involved in a church but spearheaded a whole social justice program with his Catholic sister around difficult conversations. Okay, 1999 was moved by the church to East Belfast, and over really a 10 to 12 year period, spearheaded a project called Skenos. Skenos is the Greek word for tent. And the whole concept behind that was that every person was welcomed onto the tent. So it was really exuding inclusivity, all are welcome, no matter what their background, Christian, Jew, Muslim, atheist, whatever the person was welcome onto that. What we've actually created there is a $35 million post-conflict urban village where Catholics come to, Protestants come to. 50%, it grew out of a Methodist project, so 50% of people that are working for the Methodist Church in this are Catholic. So we've really created that whole concept around inclusivity, but also ensured that we never shied away from the difficult conversations. And I think that's where the church needs to be careful, because You know, sometimes I hear people in the States say, you know, if we could just get a worship service with some black people and some white people in it. Back home we used to say, we just have some Catholics and Protestants worshipping in the same building. You know, that's okay. I'm not rubbishing that, obviously. I mean, I'm coming from a sort of clergy perspective. It's got to be more than that. Catholics and Protestants, blacks and whites, need to sit down and ask themselves difficult questions. Because that's the only way to resolve difference. I mean, the illustration I've often used, I did my sort of doctoral studies in integrative models of psychology and theology. So to use the illustration, I mean, Joyce and I have often used this illustration. I mean, let's assume in our marriage we're having difficulties, okay? Let's assume I'm either abusing alcohol too heavily, or I'm chasing after a multiplicity of women, or I'm domestically abusing my wife. And you're our therapist. And we make an appointment with you, it's for 8 o'clock tonight, we come into your room, and we don't mention that. What's going to happen? We're going to go out completely unhelped. So unless you drill down and deal with the underlying issues. So superficial conversations are not going to work in the North American context any more than they're going to work in my context. People need to, I didn't give you this quotation, just let me give you this one quotation here from a Dutch Reform professor, which is very, very pertinent, okay. Okay, here it is. He says this, reconciliation is no cheap matter, okay? It does not come about by simply papering over deep-seated differences. Reconciliation presupposes confrontation. Without that, we do not get reconciliation, but merely a temporary glossing over of differences. The running sores of society cannot be healed with the use of a band-aid. Reconciliation presupposes an operation, a cutting to the very bone without anaesthetic. The infection is not just on the surface. The abscess of hate, mistrust and fear between black and white, nation and nation, rich and poor has to be sliced open. So reconciliation is not, it's not a sort of warm, fuzzy feeling you get in your tummy. As that guy says, reconciliation presupposes confrontation. Managed confrontation, not chaotic confrontation, but hard conversations need to take place.
Questions?
So I have like a million questions, but one thing that I'm thinking about, because as you're describing the situation in Northern Ireland, it does seem to me to resonate with a lot of what I've seen in Bosnia. And one thing that I'm really curious about is what is the role of the media in, yeah, exactly, because it seems to me, yeah, it seems to me that is one way, you know, so it's interesting that you use this analogy of the abscess, because what I hear from people in Bosnia is that the differences are actually not that deep, that they get exploited by politicians for political gain, particularly at times like elections or, you know, when crucial decisions get made and kind of there's a benefit to wrangling up sectarian violence. So my question is, are the divisions that deep? And if so, then, you know, how do you get the media to help you? Or are the divisions not that deep and they just get exploited for political gain?
I mean, I think I would say that the divisions in Ireland have run very, very deep. There's no question about that. And there have been, you know, generational divisions, there's no doubt about that. Differentiating within the media, I mean, tabloids will always be tabloids and always put this chaotic approach to life. There's been some very good responsible journalism within Northern Ireland as well. And I know a number of journalists who, while they wouldn't want me even to say this, because I mean, they wouldn't describe themselves as people who were working to build peace, because professionally they would have said we had to report on a conflict within a professional framework, because that is what we do. But I know quite a number of those journalists now, Christy, are actually, you know, along with me, facilitating dialogue. So, I mean, Bram Rowan's book, I mean, I'll email you his book, The Unfinished Peace. I mean, when those Israelis and Palestinians were over with me a few weeks ago, Bram was one of the people. As a journalist, I had speaking to this emerging leadership from both Israel and Palestine, giving us journalistic perspective. I mean, 4 weeks ago, Joyce, we just arrived. Because we were in the States in January, back and forward here that much. In January, Barney did this panel of George Hamilton, Chief Constable of Northern Ireland, Evelyn Glenholm, who at one stage, IRA woman, was the most wanted woman in Britain, and along with Winston Irvine, who was a very senior UVF figure and now the Progressive Unionist Party. So journalists are doing a lot of those within an academic framework as well, and that is really helping that. With the media, it's a kind of, sometimes it's a yes, sometimes it's a no. Tabloids, your National Enquirer will always be the National Enquirer. Our Sun newspaper in Britain and the Republic will always be the Sun newspaper. You know, it's Herm, Sturm, Tell-a-Tale, and that's going to happen. And they have contributed at times to the conflict by creating division. So, I mean, there's no question, you do need mature journalism. I mean, I get blogs and articles every day from people in the United States who are journalists that are quite healthy and good. I was just saying earlier, and again, the whole concept is, sometimes I often say, see, one of the difficult things is how you get private conversations into the public space. So I have had leading IRA figures sitting down with leading UVF figures, having these most strategic conversations, but sometimes just persuading them to have this conversation in the public space is not easy. I'll give you another example of that. On my iPad there, I have a document from the leading 80 Islamic scholars in the world critiquing ISIL. The problem is, I know no one else in this room probably has that document. First of all, it hasn't been publicised widely, and some other folk are cautious just about, because of some form of extremism within Islam. The majority of folk within Islam are moderate. No matter what people say, they are moderate, they want to get on with their lives, they want to be educated, they want their kids to grow up. And the same within my community as well. Sometimes people were terrified to put their head above the parapet because it could mean their deaths. You know, so you have all those mixed human emotions spilling into these conflicts as well. But it's how, I think the other thing is, how we have the courage to do a healthy critique of our own community. Because sometimes I think within a religious framework, too many of us end up as chaplains to our own tribe. So when we formed a group in the mid-1980s which really began to critique the toxic aspects of Protestantism and unionism. Does that mean it's all bad? Most certainly not. But some people within a religious framework needed to have the courage to say, this is wrong. And we put together certain principles that were all biblical. I mean, what does love look like in a conflict? What does servanthood look like? What does identity look like? I mean, at the end of the day, in my conflict and here, I mean, some people in this conflict are more in love with the stars and stripes than they are with Jesus Christ. And it was the same in my conflict as well. You know, so it's it's critiquing that unhealthy, toxic nationalism. I know there's other questions and I'm going on too long.
Right. What role do you think that the reopening of the criminal road jail has on the continuation of the peace process?
Yeah. I think it's been great, you know. I mean, I'm involved. I mean, Joyce and I are every year, twice a year. There's a program in the United States called, and I've forgotten, I was trying to remember earlier on, the site of Jim and his wife, called BCA. So some of you want to Google it, you can enlighten me there. It's a program for about 120 American colleges. And a number of these younger people are based at Maynooth University. They come up to Belfast, and we always take them to the Crumlin Road Jail. Because in many ways, it allows them to hear the story, but it also allows that whole concept of regeneration. We were just saying earlier, I know there's this phrase in the United States as much as in Europe, gentrification. Okay? And a colleague of mine who's worked in Atlanta has often said, you know, gentrification actually is a good thing, providing gentrification is done with justice. So the key phrase is with justice. So it's how you work, not dominate, how you work alongside people whose area you want to gentrify and they feel ownership of it. I think that's been one of the success stories really of the whole Crumlin Road Jail. The other thing as well, it's trying to create spaces in Belfast. I mean, obviously you've been there, you're aware of the jail, that are what I would call porous, where people can spill in and out of each other's areas without any fear. Because at the moment the city centre, you know, for all you younger folk who are in Belfast, City centre's fine if you were living there, but there's still these segregated areas right around the whole city centre. So how do you create a porousness? And that was one of the purposes of the Skegness Centre, to create a welcoming space for all people. And that's still going to be one of the struggles as well. The other thing in relation to the Crumlin Road thing, just stretching that out a bit. Let me see, mid-1990s, businessman comes to me saying, Gary, could you begin a dialogue with loyalist paramilitaries to remove this militaristic wall mural? So this guy's a businessman, he's opened this business park, and as you drive down to the business park, there's this big ugly drawing of people with AK-47s masks on, you know the stuff I mean. And I began a dialogue. Now, it wasn't an overnight phenomenon, it took me 6 months. But one of the things they said to me was, Gary, you need to understand these murals or paintings or memorials to our dead comrades. So I took a kind of step back and says, okay, so psychologically, all of us in this room need to commemorate our dead. You know, my father's dead, I go at certain times to his grave, so all of us do that. So there's some form of memory is important. So the next step I took then was, I understand that. You need to remember your dead. That's a psychology all of us have. It says, next question let me ask you is this. How do we ensure that the children of the dead have a future? What do you mean? It says, well, while that mural is there, I think I can pretty categorically assure you that no Asian, European or American business person is going to put money in this community. So I says, let's look at a way to remember the dead in a less militaristic, terrorist-oriented fashion. So the mural was changed. So one of the challenges I think for us, you know, talking about Crumlin Road and others, how do you remember or commemorate the past without it turning into a celebration of terrorism? How do you do that? You know, so the Easter Rising, I mean, Chrissy's going to be doing this tour. I think, coming from that British Protestant Unionist loyalist tradition, I think it's crucial that that is remembered in a non-violent framework. It was a massive event within the island of Ireland. Now, some people in my community would go like this to me for even daring saying that, but that's a fact. People need to commemorate their history. But with the proviso, we cannot allow this to happen again. And it's having that undergirding that. How do we do that? So things like Crumlin Road and others, I hope, provide a framework to discuss, and the phrase I've often used is, the past is meant to be learned from, not lived in. So how do we do that? So, Jim, you're moderating there. So,
go ahead.
Why is it that 93% of kids are still educated separately, and how do you change that?
okay, well, can I say this in the Catholic Institute? Yes, of course I can. You never ask me back, I'm sure other places will, but the way it is, Catholic Church. Primarily want Catholic children educated within a Catholic framework. I understand it. I mean, some of my closest friends are Catholic priests. I understand it. And they would often say to me, well, look, Gary's people now, people who are members of the Church of England, send their kids to Catholic schools in London because it's the best schools. But I have to remind them, well, look, London is not coming out of a 30-year bloody civil war at the end of the day. There's a kind of different template functioning here at the moment. Now, interestingly, I think more and more middle-class Catholic families are slightly rebelling. And they're sending their kids to what would be Protestant state schools. So, for example, Methodist College is a very, very affluent area. So I think the statistic there, Joyce, is I think it's maybe 45% Protestant or 50% Protestant, maybe 25% Catholic and 25% other. And that's another interesting dynamic. We were just talking about what would be a sort of growing middle class within Catholics. So the phraseology that's used by sociologists is they're economic Catholics. So what does that mean? So, as I said, humorously to a couple of my colleagues, tomorrow night, let me tell you what will happen. Those economic Catholics on St. Patrick's Day will have 6 pints of Guinness and sing a few patriotic songs, yearn for a united Ireland. But on Friday, when they wake up and the British government are paying their salary of $90,000 a year, it's okay. I'm happy enough to stay part of Northern Ireland. You would ask why? Well, one reason is their Irishness is now recognised. It's acknowledged. It's recognised. And that's important. In the same way that if you were to say to me, Gary, how would you define yourself? I have a British passport. I have an Irish passport. So I have a little bit of British, Irish, Northern Irish. I'm also European. So in that sense, the more of that thinking there is, the better. Where there's not even that nationalistic porousness is healthy as well. And I know for your generation in the Republic, you know, it's a completely different place than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Completely different. And the reason for that is, I mean, there have been, you know, there have been three major scandals that have rocked the Irish Republic. There were scandals politically, there were scandals banking, and there were scandals within the church. And that has rocked the Irish Republic in many, many ways. So, I mean, the changes within that island have been phenomenal over the last number of years. Any other questions or comments?
How do you bring God into this?
How do you bring God into this? Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways that I've never been doing what you call like radical overt evangelism, but I've always done my work out of biblical principles and unashamedly. And many other, you know, the small number of sort of Catholic and Protestant clergy that were involved in what I call hardcore conversations have done the same. And I mean, I'll give you an example of that. A couple of years ago, there was an internal Protestant paramilitary feud. It was pretty bloody and brutal. And I was due to do a funeral at noon. And the previous night, someone had been shot, and there was pressure put on me not to do the funeral of this particular person. And I think I was sort of semi-rush of blood to the head, raced down to a bar where there were 100 men in this bar. And I walked into this bar and asked to see their two leaders who knew me well. Took them into the side room and I said to both of them, I said, I won't tell you their names. I said, you know, there may come a time when you will want me as a clergy person to bury a member of your family. And I said, this funeral is not about the person who is dead. The person who is dead had been involved in not very nice things. I said, this is for this person's family. And you need to give that person, within a biblical moral framework, the dignity this family allow them to mourn. After a few heated exchanges and a few experiences from them, they says, go and do your bloody funeral. So I think sometimes people of faith need to honestly claim that moral authority, not in some arrogant, bombastic way, definitely not. But within a framework that allows just common ethical decency to prevail, in a sense. And I think it's also, acknowledging, I think it's a big thing, you know, when people are brave enough to stand up in a church context and say, you know what, at times as a church we got things wrong. We were wrong. People, you know, church talks about confession. We value it both within the Catholic and Protestant tradition. But the church is not exempt from confession either. You know, so when things go wrong, have the courage and the moral integrity to say so. People out there actually, they really value that, in a sense. So though, for me, God is very much part of the framework and, you know, critiquing things. I've often said, you know, interestingly, as you look at the sort of prophets in the Old Testament, they were critiquing the nation of Israel when they went astray. And we need to have the courage within the church to critique the nation of America if we believe it is going astray, or the nation of Ireland, or Britain, or France, if it's going astray. Instead of just acquiescing the things that we shouldn't be acquiescing to. So let me go ahead there. We're still okay time-wise.
Any time for maybe one more question?
Okay.
All right, well, thank you
Okay,
very much.
then you're welcome.
Dr. Mason,
Yes, yeah.
If you want to talk to Gary Mason individually afterwards, he'll stay on for a while. Thank you.
And I mean, if you're interested, I mean, I could recommend a multiplicity of books tonight. I mean, if you're interested, Google the Northern Ireland conflict. There's 101 articles and books about it. I mean, probably the best overview book-wise is, of course, I think my memory's going. Joyce here. It's I'm looking at you as well. Your memory's going as well. It's Henry MacDonald's and David McKittrick's book. See, my wife's a better memory than me. Making sense of the troubles. It's actually a very, very good work. I mean, there's like all these conflicts, South African, Israeli, Palestinian. There's a multiplicity of these things written. Making sense of the troubles. I mean, I recommend any sort of university student coming down and to read that. It's a really good, and it's written by, you know, like David McKittrick writes for The Independent in London. So it's written from a good, balanced perspective. So it is. I mean, Bran Rowland's latest book on Finney's Piece really brings it up. Where are we going to go with this legacy issue? So listen, enjoy the rest of your evening. I am now going to where? Dan's taking me to Twin Cities for another bits and pieces tomorrow. So it is. And then Friday we go to cold Orlando, thankfully.